will have some time for discussion, I'm sure. Okay, thank you, Ron, for doing this, for sharing your expertise with us. And he brought his own camera crew, believe it or not.
I accidentally hired two. Yeah, I just want to say thanks to Beth and all of you guys for sitting on this lecture. This is a subject I'm super passionate about. I'm very excited to share my knowledge. Like most of you, when I was growing up, I never gave much thought to jeans. Everyone wore them, from my middle-aged dad, who wore horrendously fitting bootcut jeans, to my teenage sister, who every morning would coordinate her frilly tops with skin-tight jeans. Like I said, I never gave much thought to them, but this all changed when I was in middle school. I used to spend a lot of time rummaging through secondhand stores and trying to find deals on clearance racks of knockoff jeans. One day I found a piece of gold. I didn't know it at the time, but this was a designer pair of jeans recut from Levi's dead stock fabric from the 60s. Despite my ignorance of the history, something about them spoke to me. I could sense they were not a normal pair of jeans. The fabric seemed to drape in a way I had never seen before. The hand stitching, while haphazard, gave them a handcrafted flair. These jeans are nothing like I've ever seen before. I'm going to show you a picture of me wearing them. It is literally the only picture I have from middle school in them. Someone? I can also just like tap.
Yeah, you know what, I can be your, I'll be your person.
Yeah, so this is a truly ridiculous picture. It's the only one I have from this time, but I also have these ones too. And I actually have the jeans here today. If you guys want to look at them after class, I have these. I will be referencing them a bit in the lecture. So after I bought these jeans, I began researching what made them different. I scoured the web forums and encyclopedias, trying to piece together an understanding of history. I became obsessed. Every day after school, I would spend hours on the internet reading about them. My fascination with denim, particularly its interaction with the material and cultural aspects of society, continues to this day. Denim has been a delightful and integral part of my life, and I'm truly honored to share some of this knowledge with you. In this lecture, I will be exploring the ways structural changes in the classic Levi's 501 both responded to and precipitated cultural changes in the 20th century. My hope from this lecture is that you gain a better understanding of how, even today, jeans interact with the past and how powerful a marker they can be in denoting class, subculture, and national identity. As you probably already know, the origin of American jeans lie in 19th century California. However, you may not know that they did not sprout out of a vacuum. They're in some ways a continuation of a popular 17th century working class Genoese clothing made of denim. Scenes featuring these early proto-jeans were captured by an anonymous Milanese painter who historians have now dubbed the master of blue jeans. These early jeans surprisingly don't look that far off from the jeans of today. The reason I'm showing you guys these images is to emphasize that the structural changes I will be talking about are quite small, and to most would go unnoticed. However small they may be, these structural changes not only shape the form of jeans themselves, but shape the way we view these clothing, transforming it from simple workwear to an almost entirely aesthetic piece of fashion. To start off, let's look at the first pair of American jeans, billed as the Levi's 501 overall. Created in 1873, these jeans were almost entirely functional, featuring a cinched back waist, suspender buttons. These jeans were an entirely regional item, secluded only to the West Coast, where there was a large market of laborers seeking durable work pants. The wider silhouette afforded working class laborers mobility and heat dissipation necessary for working outdoors under the western sun. The inclusion of rivets for stress points such as the crotch, pockets, and seams allowed laborers to wear their pants for longer, as they were less likely to rip and tear during work. Interestingly, these jeans only feature one back pocket. Having only one pocket kept production costs low, which was important considering their market was Western laborers, who did not have much money to spend on their clothing. Next slide. The first major change to the 501 comes in 1902 when Levi's added an additional pocket to the back of the jeans. This pocket allowed more workers to hold more items on their body. However, this chain sits almost squarely within the 501's function as a functional, practical garment, removed from the realm of fashion and conspicuous consumption. In 1922, Levi's produced their first pair of jeans featuring belt loops. Prior to this time, belts were quite expensive. The leather and metal were scarce materials and required a lot of labor to create them. This kind of marks a shift in the market of jeans as the market became more available to afford items that may have been considered a luxury in the past. This new functional feature allowed them to be worn in contexts where suspenders were not appropriate. The cinch back and suspenders buttons still remained, allowing for workers to have a choice in how they want to keep their pants up. Also, if any of you guys have questions as I go through this, please feel free to interrupt. Next slide. The third major shift in the 501 occurs in 1936, when the iconic Levi's red tab was introduced to distinguish its pants from other competitors. This one's kind of ripped off. This is an actual old pair of 36s, so it's kind of yellowed out, but you can still see where the seam was. With the rise of Western films, which anachronistically depicted cowboys wearing denim, Levi's sought to capitalize on its place as the original jeans manufacturer. The red tab marks one of the first aesthetic shifts in the jeans. While the tab did serve a functional role as a distinguishing marker, it also cemented the brand identity of Levi's. The 501 was supposed to be the definitive working class pant. The eye-catching tag kind of became a social marker, signaling that the wearer was part of the in crowd, wearing the original pair of jeans. More interesting than the addition of the red tab, however, is the introduction of hidden rivets. While an older pair of jeans, the metal pieces on the pockets would be exposed. In this iteration, Levi's opted to sew over denim on the jeans. This marks kind of a domestication of jeans. The addition of the denim over it was to stop people wearing the pants from scratching furniture, tearing up pillows, and that sort of thing. This is kind of the start of the shift from the 501 being a functional piece of clothing, very practical and used in labor, towards a more social kind of clothing, worn in settings like homes and work. Next slide. I think 1942 might be the most interesting and important year in the history of the 501. As the Second World War was being fought in Europe and Japan, manufacturing shifted in the United States. The back cinch, watch pockets, and crotch rivets were removed to conserve material for the war effort. Most importantly, the iconic sewn double arches of the jeans were taken off to conserve thread. Instead of leaving the pockets unadorned, Levi's decided to paint them on. Now, this is actually the caption's wrong here. This is a 42 pair, but because these jeans are so old, the paint has worn off by now. But they were painted on there. Textile workers in the Levi's factories worked painstakingly, painting on each arc by hand. This is a watershed moment in the history of jeans, where they began to take on an aesthetic role. These painted arches served no particular functional purpose. However, they acted as a social signal. They were synonymous with the brand and called attention to the fact that the wearer was wearing these original jeans. In this time period, the aesthetic identity of Levi's began to become a defining character of his clothing. Next slide. Actually, go on the previous slide. Yeah. The 1947 Levi's 501 is the most iconic iteration of the series. With its slimmer silhouette and lack of a cinch, the jeans became a fashionable, chic pair of clothing. These were the jeans the GIs wore when they came back from the war. They were the jeans Kerouac and Cassidy wore as the Beat generation flourished along the coasts. They were the pair James Dean wore in Rebel Without a Cause. If 1942 was the year jeans adopted aesthetics, 1947 was the year aesthetics adopted jeans. At this time, the 501 was still exclusively sold in the West Coast. However, their inclusion in definitive cultural works such as photography and movies spread the aesthetic languages of jeans to the East Coast. For many East Coasters, their first introduction with jeans was not connected to the functional past as a piece of workwear, but instead its aesthetic value as a marker of anti-establishmentarianism and a refusal to conform to conservative values. Next slide. The new cultural consciousness of jeans as an aesthetic piece allowed the new markets to open for Levi's. In the 50s, we see the first pair of Levi's sold in the East Coast, with many aesthetic and functional changes to market to its new customers. The 54 Levi's, of which I have a replica right here, somewhere here. Yeah, I have a replica of these over here. Were actually the first pair of Levi's to introduce the zipper fly. Many East Coast consumers were very unfamiliar with the button fly, which I have a pair of jeans here. Instead of having a zipper, would have a series of buttons to close the jeans. These were pretty common in the West Coast, but almost unheard of in the East. While the jeans became more commonplace in the East, almost as a result of its new marketing towards consumers and the zipper fly, sort of moral panic occurred. Parents were afraid of the anti-establishmentarianism that they connoted and the rebellion that they saw in movies and media. Movies such as Blue Denim, released in 1958, blamed denim for teen pregnancy and delinquency, reflecting the moral panic. Perhaps in response, Levi's reverted the 501 to a more traditional, conservative fit in 1955. In the 1960s, this is a reproduction pair, and I'm not entirely sure this is exactly one-to-one. This looks a little bit wider. In the 60s, we see just a slight slimming of the silhouette, but not by much. These jeans were still quite loose compared to the jeans of the 40s and early 50s. The complete removal of the back rivets completed the movement of domestication started in the 30s and cemented denim as a piece of everyday fashion. The loosening of the silhouette over time in some way mirrored the jeans' cultural role in the hippie movement. The free love of the 60s could be seen on the loose flapping jeans that dotted college campuses at the time. There aren't really that many structural changes in the 501 from the 60s to the mid-80s. In 1985, Levi's shed the classic red selvage that defined its jeans. So this isn't actually a Levi's pair, but this is selvage. And the stitching that closes off the line is actually produced when the denim mill is making the fabric. Levi's switches to non-selvage denim in the 80s because selvage looms have a pretty narrow width. You need to keep the tension pretty high. When you use non-selvage denim, you have the ability to create longer yards, so it increases production efficiency. We also see a decrease in the emphasis of the 501 as Levi's flagship model, as the brands sought to reach different markets by introducing new cuts. Throughout the 90s, Levi's continued to ramp up production, as it started selling jeans in stores such as Walmart. The company started using lighter weight denim, less durable fabric, and outsourcing its production abroad. To many, myself included, this marked the end of Levi's shift towards aesthetics. This was the point where the jeans took on an almost completely aesthetic role and were almost entirely, but not fully, removed from their place as American workwear. The sacrifice of key functional features in order to market their jeans towards fashion-conscious consumers marks a huge departure from Levi's original days of marketing only towards laborers. Let's see. Yeah. This brings us next slide. Yeah. This brings us to the 21st century. Around the time I got involved in denim. Once I had my revelation of seeing denim not just as a pair of pants, but as a piece of American history, I became fascinated by finding the most authentic, most American pair of jeans. Surprisingly, my search led me to Japan instead of America. As Gap Director of Design Rebecca Bay puts it, the Japanese have a much better understanding of what is true, authentic American than the Americans. As I engrossed myself in the history of Japanese denim, I began to see the ways that politics shape denim, the way that global events such as economic treaties, wars, occupation impacted the development of jeans, not only in its structural and market ways, but in the ways that we view it culturally. In this second part of the lecture, I will be focusing on these ways that economics and politics interact with jeans, specifically focusing on Japan and the development of denim culture and industry from the 1940s to the late 20th century. However, in order to understand the development of denim in Japan, we have to understand the way in which other American fashion entered the country. Our story begins with post-war Japan. Japan had been absolutely devastated following World War II. Bombings in Tokyo, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima meant that urban centers were decimated. The surviving urban population faced supply shortages and famine. While the urban centers of Japan were in a state of disrepair, the rural countrysides did not meet the same fate. Although far from untouched, Japanese farmers were much better off in the post-war period, as their farms did not face the brunt of US bombing. In the late 40s, food shortages in Japan meant that urban dwellers had to travel to the countryside in order to barter for vegetables and other foodstuffs. With the economy crippled, many urbanites sought to trade their clothing for food. This movement of clothing from the city to the hinterland robbed urban centers from fashionable clothing. Instead, city dwellers donned tattered military uniforms and abandoned flight suits. The once colorful streets of Tokyo, adorned with kimonos and obis, became a sea of grays and browns. Although there was no explicit mandate on dress, it was understood that frugality and moderation should be practiced. However, one group defied these cultural norms, the Pan-Pan girls. These were prostitutes who posted up on the street corners surrounding US military bases. In order to attract customers, they permed their hair, wore bright red lipstick, and donned American dresses that they accepted as payment from American soldiers. The soldiers were more than willing to give up their American clothes as payment for sex, and the Pan-Pan girls in turn used these clothes to elicit more business. Now, I just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I understand the kind of gender dynamics of this. It's not exactly a wonderful exchange of clothing, but I will still be continuing to kind of show the impact that this clothing transfer had on the larger Japanese society. In the seas of gray and brown, the Pan-Pan girls stood out like peacocks. Many soldiers stationed abroad took a liking to the Pan-Pan girls and showered them with gifts of food, clothing, and Western media. In a strange turn of events, they became one of the most prosperous groups in the post-war Japan, a far cry from their low status prior to the war. Many grew envious of their newfound prosperity. As historian John Dower writes, in the years of acute hunger and scarcity, their material comfort was simply staggering to behold. The material inequality between the Pan-Pan girls and the rest of the population lent a veneer of prestige to American cultural practices. Donning Western clothing wasn't simply an aesthetic choice, but a means of upward mobility, a way to fit in with the economically prosperous army troops and secure desperately needed resources. Herein lies the genesis of Japanese obsession with American culture. The Americans were the ones who completely destroyed their country, yet they were also the only ones who could bring them much needed economic relief. American clothing was aspirational. It spoke to a desire for economic prosperity and a rejection of the impoverished state the country was in. As the cities of Japan were rebuilt, many young businessmen and designers capitalized on this newfound interest in American fashion. Kenzuki Ishizu, a Tokyo-based businessman, saw an opportunity in the burgeoning Western fashion market in post-war Japan. The used clothing of American GIs was immensely popular, but the supply was low. He envisioned a fashion industry in Japan that could produce their own Western clothing. However, there was a catch. While Western clothing was incredibly popular among men, the male market was not as responsive. It was seen as a social faux pas for men to wear ready-to-wear clothing. In order to market to men, the Shizo had to recreate the relationship between Japanese men and their clothing. Next slide, yeah. The Shizo had spent a lot of time with American GIs. The soldiers regaled him with tales of far-off universities, such as Harvard and Princeton. They described the way Ivy League students dressed. Too frugal to purchase tailor-made suits, they assembled off-the-rack clothing into interesting outfits. This concept intrigued Ishizu, and so he booked a ticket to the East Coast and toured the Ivy League. During his trips, he photographed students at 7 Ivy Leagues schools and published his photos in the book Take Ivy. This book was a huge success and cemented American fashion in the visual culture of Japan. Ivy-style clothing was hugely popular among young Japanese men, and Ishizu became venerated as a style icon. However, the Ivy style, kind of ironically, was associated with delinquency and hooliganism. Many parents did not want their kids dressing up in blazers and wingtips. Surprisingly, blue jeans, a clothing steeped in the rebellion, in rebellion, became a direct replacement, a decent replacement for Ivy. Next slide. Simultaneous to the rise of Ivy in Japan, there was a smaller fashion movement developing in the city of Kojima. The old clothings GIs would pay pan girls with found their ways into secondhand stores in the region. Although not widely seen as a fashion statement, the cotton jeans were vastly superior to the heavy wool pants sold in Japan. Jeans were much better suited for the hot summers and occasional downpours that occurred in the region. In the late 40s and early 50s, jeans weren't seen as fashionable, but rather utilitarian. Still, despite their lack of a social capital, the supply of pants could not keep up with the demand. Many Japanese businessmen in the 50s would scour U.S. military base for ripped-up jeans, often used as packaging material for care packages, and sew them back up for sale. This relative obscurity for denim in Japan did not last long. In 1951, the Allied and Axis forces signed the Treaty of San Francisco. The agreement officially ended U.S.-led occupation in Japan. The Japanese government decided to send Cambridge-educated businessman Jiro Shirazu to sign the bill. Shirazu had spent many years in San Francisco prior to the agreement. He was known for his distinctly American style, often wearing suits and even jeans when he strolled through the streets of Tokyo. Many photographers and journalists accompanied Shirazu on his trip to California. During the long plane ride, Shirazu slipped out of his stuffy business suit and donned a pair of comfortable jeans. For the remainder of the trip, whenever he was not in meetings, he would be wearing denim. When news and photographs of Shirazu wearing jeans made it back to Japan, the media went wild. The relatively obscure Western pants exploded in popularity, flying off shelves of army surplus stores and thrift stores. Prices soared as jeans became a marker of social and economic status. Only the most well-connected or well-off individuals could get their hands on a pair. These jeans stood in stark contrast to the uptight, preppy style of Ivy and became wildly popular amongst youths and even parents. Following the treaty, the Japanese